Thanks everybody for coming. This is a Calico community meeting for June 10th, 2020. I'm going to start us off just by talking about some goings on, check in on some releases and a few other things. So start with Calico 3.15, which is at this point imminent. We're just finishing up the last bits of code there. So I'll walk you through quickly some of the highlights of that are coming. A really cool one is support for migration of which data store you're using to store Calico state. So specifically the ability to migrate if you're using etcd directly to using the Kubernetes API via CRDs. So that's been merged in.
Thanks, appreciate that.
Yeah, it's been a long time coming, but it's very exciting.
Yep.
So that's merged into the Calico Kettle repo PR2133, and I think there's a corresponding docs PR that is probably going to get merged today. We've also got an update to our CRDs, to finally bring them up to the API extensions v1 API version instead of v1 beta, bringing with it schemas and some validation and all of that cool stuff. So that's really exciting as well. That was in as a PR in libcalico go to do the actual auto generation of the schemas and whatnot from the Go structs number 1237. And then all of our default install manifests and such have been updated to use those. So in 3.14, we introduced WireGuard encryption as a tech preview feature. In 3.15, we are promoting that to GA, closing off some of the final gaps around node port support and a few other things. So that'll be GA in 3.15. We've got a feature coming in which would hopefully make folks' lives easier on AWS that will optionally enable Calico to configure source destination checks on cluster instances for you, so you don't have to do that out of band through some other controller or manually or however you're doing it today. So that's really nice quality of life improvement. And then we've got a few performance improvements as well coming in. So there's been some IP tables optimization to reduce the number of places we're programming some rules. So that's very cool. And also some stuff I think we talked about last time to reduce the number of GET requests that Typha is performing against the Kubernetes API. So those are my highlights from 3.15. There's probably a bunch of other stuff in there as well, but those are the ones that I've been kind of tracking closest to my heart. So in other news, I wanted to talk quickly about this CVE that was disclosed, I think, like a week ago in Upstream Kubernetes, which is really affects all CNI plugins. So I think there's a Kubernetes issue number 91507 that talks a bit about this. And basically there was an issue where most CNI plugins didn't disable IPv6 router advertisements even on IPv4 clusters. And that meant they could trick the host in some scenarios to send some or all of its traffic to that pod as a sort of man-in-the-middle attack. So we've fixed Calico to disable router advertisements. We've done patch releases all the way back to Calico 3.8. So if you're using any of those, just make sure you're on the latest patch release and you'll be all covered. And then, yeah, Calico 3.14.1 also includes that fix and improvement for folks that are using host enforcement capabilities to add a failsafe port to access the Kubernetes API so you don't accidentally cut off traffic between your nodes and the Kubernetes API. And I think that's it for kind of upstream Calico stuff. I think we were hoping maybe, Richard, you'd be able to talk to us a little bit about the latest in the route reflector operator you've been working on.
Yes, sure. Hello, everyone. So first thing to mention, I think the proposal documentation is finished. Currently, we have 4 different kind of topologies for the different use cases and scales. And yes, thanks for all you joined to the mission, and it was a really great example how a team can work together and create something awesome. And then I started to work on a proof of concept project, which also available on GitHub. And I reached the first milestone of it. It can scale root reflectors in the simple cluster topology. It's the most simple one, which mentioned in the Calico the hardware documentation, and this is the basic setup, and it can scale. I'm working on the second phase, where it can scale in the multi-cluster topology, which means that every root reflector has its own cluster ID, and clients are connecting to at least 3 root reflectors. And the milestones and maybe the final milestone will arrive in the next couple of days. And I'm currently working on the performance testing of the topology. I have a small cluster now, and I have the BGP peers and everything's configured right now. And I would like to scale the cluster up. And that's the status and the plan. And the next should be to start implementing it into the core Calico projects.
Very cool. Thanks for sharing that. Does just crossed my mind while you were saying that. Does the controller itself configure peerings for you, or is it is that kind of out of band of the controller right now?
Yes, it must be configured because it knows the topology, and if it doesn't configure, we need an other operator which can configure the BGP peers. But I think it's more overhead to fetch all the nodes and BGP peers in 2 separated controllers. So for performance reason, I think it would be better to do it in one place. And currently I reorganized my proof of concept project, and the KDD and ATC data store, and also the topologies, the single and multi-cluster, are just lightweight plugins in the project. So we can use the plugins in other places as well.
Richard, when you get a chance, can you share the links to the documents and code in the meeting notes when you have the opportunity to?
Yes, sure.
Thank you.
Is there anyone on who can talk to the Calico VPP project a little bit?
I can say a few words if there's nobody from the team that's working on that.
I can say a few words too.
Oh, hey Nathan. Yeah,
but
go for it.
go on. As you like. Yeah, Jean and Alex couldn't join the conflict meeting, so yeah, hello everyone. Concerning the integration, the status, we did a POC and a blog article for encrypted IPSEC, an encrypted IPSEC cluster at 40G that we released a few weeks ago now. But that was really only pod to pod. The full big picture isn't yet supported. We've did a bit some steps back on the cluster IP and node port support. That should come back fairly soon. So we're still in the process of doing polishing to have an actual support of all the feature exposed. Making some progress there. The some of the NAT related features also need a bit of VPP specific development, so they might take a bit longer. Namely, the source netting of outgoing traffic will be a bit hard to do with the current status, but we're making good progress on this. I don't know what was the status. I think there was a discussion on merging the PR we had in the CNI. I think it got accepted to make the backend, data plane backends configurable. So we should be able to rebase on the 3.15 once it gets out. For now, our demonstrator is based on 3.9, so we're quite far behind. But we're making good progress there. I don't know if you have specific questions on.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I can just confirm that PR was merged, so all good.
Maybe I had a question for the Calico team and community, because we started to do a bit of testing on our own end to see how to confirm that we don't break any features and we support most of the feature. Are you using something specific apart from the Kubernetes test environment, or?
So we have a lot of like in repo unit and FE tests that spin up different components in isolation,
Okay.
or rather various levels of isolation to test different features. I'm not sure. I mean, some of those might be something that you could leverage, but some of them are also probably pretty specific to the pieces that they're testing. We do run various selections of the Kubernetes end-to-ends as well pretty regularly. And we have some kind of augmented end-to-ends that we've written for some Calico specific features. But I don't think that those are open source right now. So we'd have to figure out how to expose those. They test things like global network policy and Calico features like that.
Yeah, we don't have yet policy support, because that would require a lot more work inside of VPP2. So.
Yeah, I think probably would be interested in the Calico node test in repo tests. They do a lot of kind of not quite full end-to-end, but they spin up like a real data plane with real workloads and test connectivity in various scenarios. So that might be an interesting place to start.
Okay. I'll go take a look then. Thanks.
I had one other thing just cross my mind. It's probably worth mentioning. We updated the quick start guide in master and soon to be 3.15 to use the operator-based install method for Calico. So I'm pretty excited about seeing where that goes and the extra feedback we'll get from folks once they start trying that out more generally. But wanted to give a heads up to anybody who either might be waiting for those instructions, or might be using the quick start guide for some other purpose, just so that change is coming. So why don't we move on? I have a couple quick issues to highlight in the hot issues section, and anyone else can feel free to jump in and shout out if you know of other issues that you think should be getting community attention. The first one I wanted to bring attention to is in the Calico repo, number 1055. This is actually a pretty old issue, but it's jumped back to the front of my mind recently because it's gotten a few more pokes. So there's some upstream tests that assert that if you try to connect to a service with no endpoints in it, that connection will be rejected. Today, when you're running Calico, that connection isn't rejected. The traffic is just black holed, and your connection will hang until it times out. And the fundamental reason that I would characterize that is just that Calico treats that service traffic the way it would for any other thing that isn't a pod in the cluster. It accepts it via its default egress behavior, and it gets sent out. So that Calico accepts that traffic, and it doesn't have the ability to hit the kube proxy rule that comes later, which rejects it. So I think we're hoping to address this in the near future. Don't know exactly what the fix is yet, but there are a couple ideas in the issue. So if anybody has thoughts on that, please do check it out. And then the second one I wanted to bring up, just because we've done a fair bit around host protection with host endpoints recently. I mentioned earlier that we added a failsafe port for the Kubernetes API, and shortly after doing that, realized we also probably want a failsafe port for connections to Typha. So we'll be adding that hopefully soon as well. But in the meantime, you can change Felix's default failsafe ports via a configuration option. So if you are doing host endpoint protection with Typha enabled, it's probably best if you use the Felix configuration to add port 5473.
Yeah, Casey, one thing I noticed is that with the operator-based installation, when I tried it out, it installed Typha by default. So this will probably become more important if Typha is part of the default installation.
Yeah, for sure. So those are the two that are kind of on my mind. But But if anybody else has issues or things that they've been thinking about, feel free to shout them out and we can talk about them.
And the reason failsafe ports are coming up a lot is because we've added that feature that adds automatic host endpoints for you. So once you have that feature, it's much easier to add host endpoints, much easier to use that feature and secure your hosts. But then you need to worry about the bootstrapping ports that are needed. So that's why we've been sort of worried about that.
Yeah, I agree. It's definitely a big part of it.
One very small one is we've spotted that for the WireGuard tech preview, we didn't have the right docs in place for configuring MTU, so we're fixing that up, and we can do that out of band of a release, so the docs will just get updated.
Yep, thanks, Alex.
My pleasure.
Sorry?
Oh, it's Alexis. He's the guy who spotted it.
Oh, yes, okay. I didn't quite catch what was said. I just heard somebody talking. Hi, Alexis.
Hi there.
Cool. So let's move on and talk about some Calico Heroes. Does anybody have nominations? Just to shout out folks that are doing cool stuff in the community.
I think he's on the call, but Ricardo Katz has been helping me out a lot. He had a cluster that had really high data plane apply times. I've been giving him patches to try out, and he keeps spinning those up on his cluster, trying out like experimental builds and giving me loads of feedback on it. So that's really that's been really helpful.
Yeah, Ricardo's fun because one of the things he likes to do is run like hundreds and hundreds of pods, which tends to push some of Kubernetes stuff to the limits.
Yeah, we kind of designed for like 30 pods with headroom for 150, and he runs about 600 or 700. So it kind of pushes things beyond where we'd sort of designed it for, really. But we did find a sort of a bug scaling to that level. So hopefully we'll get that fixed at some point, and the CPU usage and stuff will come down when he's at that higher scale. And that will benefit everyone else once we fix it as well.
Pods per node you're talking about there.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So it's the routing table logic has a couple of assumptions that don't hold once you get loads of pods in it. So it's a little bit slower than it should be. I'm hoping we can get a fix in for in an upcoming release.
I wanted to mention Jonathan Bryant, who was one of the people who's on the call right now, and we interviewed him for the Calico users research program, and he gave us a lot of great information about how how his company is using Calico and the large deployments that they're doing for the Department of Defense. And I really appreciated the hour of his time that he gave me and the great feedback that he gave me about the project.
Been reading about, hi, I'm Jonathan. I've been reading about VPP since Chris told me about it, and that seems like a really cool direction. Never heard of it before, but I'm really impressed by the work you guys are doing.
Cool. Thanks for coming, Jonathan. And
Have we got Alexis on the list for putting Calico through its paces and like keeping us honest?
I think we should.
And for reminding us that we really, really need to do automatic MTU configuration.
I'm pretty sure that that GitHub issue is one of, if not the oldest one that's left at this point.
I'm very happy to see Auto MTU coming to Calico because it's such a game breaker in performances in CNI today. It's very, very a good feature now. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I think the thing that's held us back from doing that before is just sort of letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. Like we can guess a pretty good value for most clusters fairly easily, but you sort of get into thinking like, but how do you do it perfectly in all scenarios? And you just can't. It's impossible. So I think we probably want a simple automatic mode and then manual override when you have one of those, 1% clusters that we can't handle. I think that's probably what's held us back a bit.
Yeah, I think that's scheduled for 3/16. Is that right, Casey?
Yeah, that's right.
So very soon, and then there will be much rejoicing.
I've had enough of MTUs. It's been the bane of my life the last few weeks.
One point of attention on this case is what will you do about Auto MTU configuring with Wireguard? So we detected this week that Wireguard was adding some overhead over on the MTU. You have to reduce MTU for Wireguard. Will you auto-configure the MTU with the fact that someone could even activate Wireguard later and then prepare the MTU to welcome the Wireguard problem? Or will you do the best like for VXLAN, just reducing by 50 the MTU PDU?
Yeah, it's good. This is a good question, and I'm not sure we've entirely decided what we want to do there. Like at a minimum, we'll do the kind of the equivalent of the VXLAN thing. We may push further than that and do something a little bit more dynamic if you switch Wireguard on, but I don't think we've decided yet.
Okay.
Like in theory, so long as you're not doing something like UDP, then you'll get your ICMP message through and everything will adjust automatically at runtime. But it's a bit more of a question mark for some UDP traffic. Really depends on who's sending the UDP traffic and whether they dynamically adjust to ICMP.
Okay, well, who's ready for a demo? I think we've got Jason on to talk to us a little bit about the cluster API. If you're ready, Jason.
Yes, sure. Let me go ahead and share my screen here.
Oh yeah, let me stop my share here.
Thank you.
Yeah, and for those of you who don't know Jason, he works for VMware, works very closely with the cluster lifecycle, SIG cluster lifecycle, among other groups, and is working on the VMware cluster API provider, which depends on Calico for its networking in part. So I thought it would be interesting to see how they're using it and how places that we might be able to collaborate more closely.
Awesome, thanks, Chris. So I'm going to try to give a fast rundown here. Normally we take a lot more time with kind of going through cluster API, but in a nutshell, cluster API is meant to bring declarative Kubernetes style APIs to the lifecycle management of Kubernetes clusters. So basically managing Kubernetes clusters the same way that you manage any other Kubernetes resource. We have documentation out here. There's also a CNCF webinar that's happening tomorrow. So if you're really more interested in learning about the project, I'd recommend attending that CNCF webinar, and they'll go a lot more in depth than I can today. So to give a quick start, I'm basically going to be following our quick start guide, but in order to not spin up actual cloud resources in AWS or GCP or other clouds, and for the sake of time, I'm going to be using a Docker-based cluster API provider to spin up the cluster. We don't ship it by default, but if you are interested in replicating this, you will also have to follow the steps in our Cluster Cuddle for Developers guide, which brings me to the Cluster Cuddle tool, which I'm going to use to stand up the cluster. It's a command line tool for basically managing the operational lifecycle management of cluster API management cluster itself. So the cluster that you're going to use to manage other Kubernetes clusters that we use the terminology for a workload cluster for those clusters that you're managing with cluster API. You can also use Cluster Cuddle to stamp out individual clusters from templates, individual workload clusters from templates as well. So let me go ahead and get this kicked off. So and this step right here is basically directly out of the quick start guide. What it's doing right now is it's basically deploying Cert Manager, and then it's going to pull down the individual cluster API components, both the core components for managing the high-level resources. It's going to pull down the infrastructure Docker provider that I'm using for this purpose. It's also going to download the default what we call bootstrap provider and control plane provider, which are both based on kubeadm for Upstream. But we have these provider interfaces so that you're not locked into what we provide directly upstream in repo. Other people can create providers to fulfill these needs as well. So now I have my Cluster API management server. What I can go ahead and do now is actually deploy a workload cluster. So here, using the cluster cuddle config cluster command, I'm going to create a cluster named demo with Kubernetes version 1.18.2. Oh. And because I didn't actually output that to kubectl, it actually just printed the process template for me. So here we can see we have various CRD-based resources. I'm not going to spend too much time going into them, but it's going to configure the cluster resource. It's going to configure the kubeadm control plane. It's going to configure what we call a machine deployment for this cluster. So now that that's actually going, I can actually come in here and kubeconfig or kubectl get cluster API, and it will show me all of the resources that I've just created. And we have our cluster resource. We have an AWS or Docker cluster specific cluster resource that provides kind of any type of infrastructure that we need. In our case, it's just providing a load balancer for the control plane machines that are being created. We have our kubeadm control plane, which basically provides the lifecycle management of the control plane for us. And then we have a machine that is backing that control plane that is being provisioned. And there will also be a Docker machine resource that is actually backing that machine resource that provides us the infrastructure underneath via Docker. So once that gets a little bit closer, so let me check the status of my kubeadm control plane.
So is the idea there that you would have a provider that would provide a VMware plugin or a GCP plugin or whatever? When you ask for a machine, you would get whatever machine type it is that you want.
Exactly. And we have some various providers that are included out of the box with Cluster Cuddle. Config, let me see, repositories, that's what I'm looking for. So here we have the kind of core provider for the core Cluster API components. And for the infrastructure providers, we have AWS, Azure. Docker isn't one of the default ones. I had to go through the developer instructions to make that one available. There's a Metal 3 provider that is based on the OpenStack Ironic project, and an OpenStack provider and the vSphere provider are the ones that are available by default. But getting back on track a little bit, the cluster that I created is now actually available. It's got a backing machine behind it. But if I go ahead and fetch the kube config for this, let me just copy this because it's a little bit longer of a command. Every time we create a cluster, we create a kubeconfig secret that can be used for accessing that cluster. And if I come here, and do a get nodes on here, what we'll see is that the control plane instance is not actually ready yet. And that's because today we don't really do any automation around deploying CNI. So right now we have a cluster, it doesn't have a CNI provider. So as a result, any machines that we create, the backing nodes will not be ready. So let me go ahead and resolve that. And in my case, right now I'm deploying Calico 3.12 only because that's a version that I previously tested. So I know there's not any potential issues that are going to crop up with it. But in theory, any version of Calico, if it works with the version of Kubernetes that we're shipping, should work out of the box. And if I go ahead and get nodes now, I'm going to see it's ready. I can come back and check out my KCP resource. And here shortly, we're going to see that it is now ready. And at this point, I can take various operations. I can scale up this control plane to make it HA. I actually have a machine deployment resource here, which is basically a declarative way to manage a group of nodes, very similar to the way that a deployment manages pods in Kubernetes. I could scale that up, and right now the default was to basically create, have the replicas set at 0 by default, and if I wanted to, I can scale it up. But I don't think that's necessarily the interesting thing for this meeting, because your new operator-based deployment model will open up some very interesting integration possibilities as we try to automate the CNI installation process, which is currently very manual.
Very cool. Thanks, Jason. I had a couple questions.
Yes.
So first is more of a just interest. Like, do you know how that kubectl get cluster API command works to show like that whole suite of different APIs under one meta command?
Yes, so I'm probably going to mess up my terminology here, but when you're defining a CRD, you can specify different resources to be grouped similarly. And when we built out at least the core cluster API resources and many of the providers, we put them in that cluster API group, for lack of a better way for me to remember the exact terminology for what it's called, so that anytime you just provide cluster API, it prints out for you.
Right. Okay. So you can kind of add a group of some sort to a CRD, and then it will magic that behind the scenes for you.
Exactly.
That's cool. I wonder how we can leverage that. Seems like a neat thing. My second question was more around like these clusters that are created. Are they aware in any way that they've been created through a cluster API provider, or is it all sort of unidirectional from the top down?
Today, they are not aware that they're being managed externally by Cluster API. As far as they're concerned, they're just a Kubernetes cluster running somewhere. The management cluster tries to be very external, and we try not to have too many integration points because we want to enable the community to easily build additional providers, whether infrastructure providers or bootstrap providers or control plane providers.
Yep. Yeah. Sorry?
I said it brings up a really interesting point, though, which is I think where you're headed with this is like, you know, since you have cluster API that is managing the like that deployment of machines, how do you handle things like scaling? Right? Like how do you handle things like autoscale or those sorts of things? And this is definitely one of the challenges I think inside of the project, because there still has to be some relationship between the guest cluster and the parent cluster for stuff like that.
Yes, indeed. And one of the things that we're actually actively working on right now is better integration with the Upstream cluster Autoscaler project. A little while back, they added support for a cloud provider that is targeting cluster API. And we've been working on trying to build automated Upstream test suites between the two projects to ensure that everything is working the way that we expect. So we're still defining what this relationship fully looks like, but we expect in the common case, people will be able to deploy cluster autoscaler on the management cluster for a workload cluster that they want to enable autoscaling for. And that cluster autoscaler connects both to the internal management cluster to access the cluster API related resources, and also the workload cluster to access the node resources and other scheduler primitive type resources that it needs to make the scaling decisions. So I expect to see that start to mature a lot better and be something that we'll see more people commonly run in here within the next few months to a year.
I've got a couple questions as well.
Okay.
Is it possible for a management cluster to self-define?
So we do have the concept of a self-managed management cluster. You know, for the purposes of this demo, I ran everything in Docker, but if I was running this against AWS or another kind of more or non-ephemeral infrastructure, I would have been able to run a cluster cuddle move command here that would move all of the currently defined cluster API components and the resources that I created to management club. I created to deploy the cluster. I could move those to the cluster that I just created, making it a self-managed cluster that is running standalone. And then I can use that to run additional workload clusters or manage additional workload clusters from, yeah.
Okay. And this is probably an ignorant question because I haven't been following the cluster API project closely, but what's the difference between cluster API and say kubespray?
So I think the biggest difference is that kubespray tends to be a bit more disconnected from the upstream Kubernetes SIGs in a way. It is a SIG cluster lifecycle sub-project, but there isn't a lot of work to do kind of core tight integration with both the upstream testing process and release process. And one of the things that we're doing with the Cluster API project is trying to replace some of the hacky primitives that we've used in the upstream Kubernetes EDE suites with Cluster API so that as we're building new cluster Kubernetes versions, we're testing integration with them with Cluster API and kind of building kind of the support for managing the clusters closer to the development lifecycle of Kubernetes, so that you don't end up with these weird things like a new version of Kubernetes is released and now you're trying to retrofit everything to work with 119 versus 118, and we're trying to kind of streamline that process so as the development happens, those changes are landing both in Cluster API and Kubernetes to facilitate a tighter integration. And we also, as we were building this, we didn't want to be prescriptive about how do you extend this. So, obviously KubeSpray is Ansible based. If you wanted to extend it, your options are generally to, extend and modify the existing Ansible code. Here, adding a new provider for something, or if you wanted to swap out the bootstrapping provider for some very specific, like the Talos system folks have their own bootstrapper to work with their bootstrapping process because they have a very minimal Kubernetes focused distribution that doesn't use kubeadm. They have an API based bootstrapper. So they built their own bootstrapper to be able to enable, booting those Talos clusters.
Yeah, that's kind of what we're using kubeadm and Ansible in a similar method. But speaking of kubeadm, does Cluster API replace or extend it?
So our goal was basically to build upon other SIG cluster lifecycle projects as much as we could. So our default bootstrapping provider and control plane provider are kubeadm opinionated. They bake in both some assumptions about how kubeadm sets up clusters, but also leverage kubeadm underneath the hood to do the bootstrapping. And as more SIG cluster lifecycle projects become mature, like etcd ADM, we hope we can leverage that to help enable different deployment topologies by default. As projects like the cluster add-ons project becomes mature, we're hoping that we can leverage that to do things like manage the lifecycle of not just the internal operators that we need for a default kubeadm cluster like core DNS and kubeproxy and those sorts of things, but also potentially CNI and potentially managing a Calico operator so that we can potentially have tighter integration. One of the pain points that we have today is when somebody's deploying CNI, we can't really help them make the right infrastructure choices by default. So depending which CNI you deploy, you may have different firewall requirements between your hosts. You may have to specify different API server arguments. Today, we kind of bake in Calico to the defaults that we have in our templates to kind of make that work. And in some cases, baking those into the firewall requirements that we have in some of the different cloud providers, just so it works out of the box. Ideally, over time, some like the cluster add-ons project can expose some of that metadata of what does this add-on need to run, and we could potentially automate some of that for users where we can't today.
Somebody interrupt me if I'm taking too much time.
No, I was just going to say, I'd like to open it up for just general questions. That doesn't mean you have to stop asking questions to Jason, but feel free to ask any variety of question you might have.
I have one question that, first of all, thank you for your demo. So I would like to ask you, what needs to be done to add a new cloud provider, for example, IBM Cloud?
So there actually is an IBM Cloud provider already, amazingly. But if you wanted to add a new one, basically, we have, at least for infrastructure providers, we have a guide in our documentation that says basically walks you through how to use the controller runtime controller tools tooling from QBuilder to create one from scratch using an actual an email service as an example kind of walkthrough. And basically it's implement 3 CRD-based APIs. You need a infrastructure cluster resource to back kind of common infrastructure for a cluster. In AWS, we do VPC, security groups, an ELB for the API server, that sort of thing. An infrastructure machine resource, which backs the actual individual machines. And then what we call like an infrastructure machine template, which can be used for stamping out machines for the purposes of both the kubeadm control plane and machine deployments.
Thank you.
How does Cluster API handle cluster upgrades?
Yes, so prior to our most recent V1 Alpha 3 oriented API release, we kind of externalized it. We made it like an exercise for the user, but by introducing the kubeadm control plane resource and the control plane provider in general, it's the responsibility of that controller to basically orchestrate the upgrade of the control plane. So in the kubeadm control plane example, if somebody modifies the configuration in any way, they modify the version, or they even just want to trigger like a rolling update to pick up maybe a new AMI that was deployed that fixed the CVE, there's a timestamp field called upgrade after. If any of those conditions happen, we basically do a one-by-one rolling upgrade of the control plane for the user. And then the rest is the worker machines. And as long as somebody's using a machine deployment, if you update the version or the declarative config there, it'll do the same thing, except there's a little bit more flexibility on you know, how much that machine deployment will surge for the upgrade compared to the control plane.
One of the questions that I've seen come up recently around this topic, which I thought was pretty interesting, was that people were asking, say I want to do a certain set of things before I drain a node. And the neat thing about the cluster API object is because this is a programmatic interface, this is an API around which I can reason about these things. I can actually have a model where I'm evaluating some set of labels on that node before proceeding with like actually handling a rolling update, right? Like I could mark it ready for that change and then work that into the node health check so that when I'm actually evaluating whether I'm able to remove a node, I can actually do things like, you know, has the stateful storage been replicated somewhere else before I actually nuke that node? But it's pretty neat.
Yeah, and we're still working to define exactly what that's going to look like and how that looks, but it is something that we're looking to add relatively soon. One of the other things, thanks Duffy for mentioning, is the machine health check, in that you can configure different aspects to look at. So if you, for example, we're running a different type of controller to detect additional problems that you don't get out of the standard kind of node readiness check, you can actually mark those nodes as not being well. The machine health check can detect that, and it can automatically remediate those machines for you. So it sees something's wrong, it'll mark that machine. Well, today it'll actually delete the machine. We're moving to a model where it will mark that machine for deletion, and then the remediation will happen, and you should continue to run at that point too. So.
I wanted Alexis, given you're on the call, and I know you're very busy looking at a whole bunch of CNIs at the moment. Do you want to say just 1 minute about what you're up to, so folks here You're on mute.
Sorry, I did not understood all the things you said. I'm not a very good English speaker.
Sure. I was saying, do you want to just say a little bit about what you're working on at the moment?
Oh, okay, about CNI benchmark. So, what do you want I to tell about?
just tell folks like what you're busy doing and.
Okay, actually, I'm working on comparing several CNIs in terms of performance. I'm benchmarking Calico, Cilium, Flannel, Canal, and Cube Router. I'm sorry for ContiVPP because I don't want to benchmark the CNI because it's too hard for me to set up and too much time to set up. It's a bit a problem for me to expose a CNI that is not easy to install because you made hard stuff to work to get people able to set up with Calico CNI with just one line, just a kubectl line. Cilium did the same, Flannel did the same, everyone did the same. So that's why ContiVPP was a bit on the corner. And I was testing about with out of the documentation CNI performance versus tuning CNI performances, and by opposing to Ubuntu 18.04 and Ubuntu 20.04 performance. And there are such interesting thing like it seems that on Ubuntu 20.04 benchmark performances are a bit lower than in 18.04. I've seen also that eBPF data plane is maybe a bit, I don't know the term, but wider in terms of memory usage than IP tunneling or VXLAN tunneling. And for now, I've just got a bunch of raw data which are not for now interpreted. I'm planning to write a new version of the article of benchmark CNI that I published last year, and all comments are welcome. Still trying to enhance the benchmark, and feel free to suggest anything.
Great. Thanks, Alexis. I think we're at time now, but if folks want to contact you, how can they do that? Just on Slack?
Alexis is on the Calico user Slack. We've been helping him through the odd wrinkle.
Yep.
Cool. Well, yeah, like I said, we're at time, but thanks so much everybody for coming. Our next meeting, I believe, is July 8th.
Sorry for interrupting. Actually, I had a question regarding SC90X.
Sorry, regarding what?
SC90X architecture. So it will be short. So earlier when we started pushing changes for SC90X, we were asked not to push any more changes until or unless Go build issue gets resolved for cross build. And currently we are still facing that issue. And I just wanted to ask whether we can still push changes for SC90X alone, but they won't be tested in the CI unless Go build supports it. So are we still allowed to do that, or shall we wait for the Go build issue to get fixed first?
What sort of changes are you wanting to push downstream?
So, so actually there are some changes when we try to build on SC90X, when we try to do the native build. There are some changes regarding dockerfile.sc90x or some changes in the make file maybe. So are we
feel free to push those, and I'll help you get those merged. yeah, we could do with figuring out a way to get the Go build thing working. It's a real shame that it was broken by moving to Go 1.14.
Yeah, actually, we are still working on that, and we have found that the issue is with KMU actually. So we have raised an issue with multi-hour Git KMU user static community, and we are waiting for the reply actually. So I didn't get whether we are allowed to push changes which are only for SC90X currently, or shall we wait for the Go build to get fixed first?
Yeah, so feel free to put up your PRs, and but I can help you with those.
Okay, okay. Thanks, Sean.
Thanks, everybody. See you all next time.